Good morning to each one of you. It's a pleasure for me to be here today and to return as a speaker at one of your conferences. I would like to thank Dr. Jane Orient and the Doctors for Disaster Preparedness for inviting me to speak. You represent a wonderful group of scientists and professionals, and I enjoy the association I've had with many of you over the years. I've titled my talk, Expected Biospheric Impacts of Rising Atmospheric CO2. For the past 20 years, I've been researching the climatological and biological effects and non-effects of rising atmospheric CO2 on the biosphere. During that time, I've conducted my own research, published articles both within and without the world of scientific peer review, written multiple books, produced video clips and feature-length documentaries, provided commentary on thousands of peer-reviewed scientific papers, and authored and co-edited multiple international tomes. One of the most important lessons I have learned in the process is that there is no viable substitute for the scientific method when it comes to searching for scientific truth. As such, I've come to ever more appreciate those scientists working in the trenches who form hypotheses, design and conduct experiments, collect and analyze real-world observations, and who then formulate data-based conclusions. Each week for the past 2 decades, I have read several hundred abstracts of newly published scientific papers that deal with some aspect of the climate change debate. I'm sorry to say that over the years, fewer and fewer are the number of studies that properly utilize the scientific method. Nowadays, it seems far easier to get a paper published if you deal in the virtual world, where model projections are often given equal or even superior treatment to that which is observed in the real world. Worse still is the fact that many governments and nations of the earth have formed policy that is primarily based on model projected output, while ignoring or ignorantly overlooking a vast array of real-world data that would likely inform them otherwise. Now, such is the sad state of climate alarmism which has swept the scientific and political world like a hurricane, leaving few, if any, competing views standing in its wake. False statements such as 97% of all scientists agree that climate change is a dangerous problem are bandied about in an effort to claim moral superiority, as if science or truth is fashioned by polls or a majority vote. Those who disagree with or oppose the climate cabal are often heavily criticized, as Willie just mentioned, or professionally shunned or silenced. Yet despite such pressures, there are a good number of scientists who continue to champion the scientific method. Each week, my organization highlights the work of several of these individuals in review articles posted on our CO2 Science website, which you can freely access at co2science.org. Now, over the years, we have amassed thousands of such reviews, which together provide a pretty clear and convincing picture of a number of expected biospheric impacts of rising CO2, some of which I will share with you here today. In doing so, I've chosen to highlight the specific findings of several papers recently reviewed on our website, intermixed with generalizations that can be drawn from other works that are archived there. For time constraints, I will limit my comments to focus on the biological impacts of rising atmospheric CO2, though we could clearly spend an equal or even greater amount of time discussing the climatological impacts. It is my hope that by the end of our time together, you will come away with a greater appreciation of the scientific work that continues to be conducted in the trenches by those who love and support the scientific method. The first major impact I wish to note is illustrated in a recent paper by Gong et al. Publishing their work in the journal Plant, Cell, and Environment, this team of 5 researchers investigated the growth response of sunflower plants to increases in the air's CO2 content. Now, this was accomplished by growing sunflower seeds in plastic pots in controlled environment chambers under CO2 concentrations of 200 and 1,000 parts per million for a period of 42 days. At the end of the experiment, Gong et al. Reported that elevated CO2 increased plant photosynthesis by 91%, plant net productivity by 77%, and plant dry mass by 52%. Thus, it would appear that in the future, as one of the top 35 crops in terms of global food production, sunflower plants and the farmers who grow them will likely reap significant growth-enhancing benefits, courtesy of the rising concentrations of atmospheric CO2. Now, this benefit of increased productivity at higher CO2 levels is really not all that surprising, considering that carbon dioxide is the primary raw material utilized by plants during the process of photosynthesis to build and construct their tissues. As such, it is the food that sustains essentially all plants on the face of the earth, and the more CO2 they eat or take in from the air, the bigger and better that they grow. My company, the Center for the Study of Carbon Dioxide and Global Change, has been investigating the effects of atmospheric CO2 on plants for decades now. On our website, we maintain a plant growth database where we have archived the results of literally thousands of laboratory and field CO2 enrichment studies. Now, based on numerous experiments listed there, I can tell you that typically a 300 part per million increase in the air's CO2 content will raise the productivity of most herbaceous plants by about 1/3, which stimulation is generally manifested by an increase in the number of branches and tillers, more and thicker leaves, more extensive root systems, and more flowers and fruit. The growth response of woody plants to atmospheric CO2 enrichment has also been extensively studied. Reviews of numerous individual woody plant experiments have revealed a mean growth enhancement on the order of 50% for a doubling of the air's CO2 content, which is about 1.5 times as much the response as that of herbaceous plants. Although much less studied than terrestrial plants, many aquatic plants are also known to be responsive to atmospheric CO2 enrichment, including unicellular phytoplankton and bottom-rooted macrophytes of both freshwater and saltwater species. Hence, there probably is no category of photosynthesizing plant that does not respond in a positive manner to atmospheric CO2 enrichment and that is not likely to be benefited by the ongoing rise in the air's CO2 content. So what does the growth-enhancing benefit of atmospheric CO2 portend for the biosphere? One obvious consequence is greater crop productivity, and many researchers have acknowledged the yield-enhancing benefits of the historical and still ongoing rise in the air's CO2 content on past, present, and future crop yields. In this regard, in my own studies, I've calculated that the benefits of CO2 in agriculture are so important that without them, world food supply will fall short of world food demand in just a few short decades from now. I've also calculated the direct monetary benefits of atmospheric CO2 enrichment on both historic and future global crop production. Over the 50-year time period from 1961 to 2011, that benefit amounts to over $3.2 trillion. And projecting that monetary value of this positive externality forward in time reveals that it will bestow an additional $9.8 trillion on crop production between 2012 and 2050. And as amazing as that sounds, this estimate may very well be undervalued. Now consider, for example, the fact that rice is the third most important global food crop, accounting for 9.4% of total global food production. Based on data presented in our CO2 Science Plant Growth Database, the average growth response of rice to a 300 part per million increase in the air's CO2 content is about 37%. However, a team of researchers who studied the growth responses of 16 different rice genotypes reported CO2-induced productivity increases in those genotypes that ranged from 0 to a whopping positive 263%. Therefore, if countries learned to identify which genotypes provided the largest yield increases per unit of CO2 rise, and then grew those genotypes, it is quite possible that the world could collectively produce enough food to supply all the needs of its inhabitants, staving off the crippling food shortages that are projected to occur in just a few short decades from now. Well, and unfortunately, because our government mindset has so long viewed CO2 as a pollutant, research has progressed but little on this front. Nevertheless, considering such benefits, it should come as no surprise that the father of modern research in this area, Dr. Sylvan H. Whitwer, has stated that it should be considered good fortune that we are living in a world of gradually increasing levels of atmospheric CO2, and that the rising level of atmospheric CO2 is a universally free premium, gaining in magnitude with time, and on which we can all reckon for the future. A second major benefit of atmospheric CO2 enrichment is increased plant water use efficiency. Plant water use efficiency is the amount of biomass produced by a plant per unit of water lost via transpiration. And what we find here is that plants exposed to elevated levels of atmospheric CO2 generally do not open their leaf stomatal pores as wide as they do at low CO2 concentrations. And the result is a reduction in most plants' rates of water loss by transpiration. and thus the amount of carbon they gain per unit of water lost or water use efficiency therefore typically rises for a doubling of CO2 on the order of 70 to 100%. So at higher atmospheric CO2 concentrations, it has been observed that plants need less water to produce the same or an even greater amount of biomass. With smaller stomatal openings, plants exposed to elevated levels of atmospheric CO2 tend to become less susceptible to drought, losing less water to the air via transpiration. As such, they will be able to grow and reproduce where it has previously been too dry for them to exist. And consequently, Earth's terrestrial vegetation should become more robust as the air's CO2 concentration rises and begin to win back lands previously lost to desertification. Simultaneously, the greater vegetative cover of the land produced by this phenomenon should reduce the adverse effects of soil erosion caused by the ravages of wind and rain. Now, as demonstrated in the next few slides, real-world evidence for the effectiveness of these many benefits is evident in long-term observations of plants, especially in water-limiting regions. One of the most recent studies in this regard comes from the research team of Chowdhury et al., who analyzed long-term trends in the intrinsic water use efficiency of native Aleppo pines growing in Algeria. There, near the relatively dry northern border region of the Sahara Desert, they cored multiple trees from 3 locations so as to evaluate historic trends in water use efficiency over the period 1925 to 2013, during which time the mean annual temperature rose by 1.5 degrees Celsius and atmospheric CO2 concentrations rose by approximately 30%. Now, as illustrated in this figure, Chowdhury et al. Found that there was a 39% increase in intrinsic water use efficiency across the 3 sites, leading the seven researchers to conclude that their study highlights the substantial plasticity of Aleppo pines to warming-induced drought stress, while adding that the extent of such plastic responses from Aleppo pines growing at the southernmost limit of the species distribution area is, from a physiological point of view, remarkable. Another nice visualization of the benefits of atmospheric CO2 enrichment on plant water use efficiency is depicted in this next slide. In the upper panel, we see the incredible rise in water use efficiency of ponderosa pine and Douglas fir trees that occurred over the past century and a half in the northern Rockies region of the USA, courtesy of the modern rise in atmospheric CO2. The bottom panel shows a co-occurring rise in tree basal area index over the same period, especially over the latter half of the 20th century, which increased the author's report came despite no favorable changes in climate. In this next slide, we see a similar graphic from Europe and southern Chile. Using a network of 35 tree ring sites across the European continent, a team of 31 researchers from 9 different countries produced the century-long record of European forest intrinsic water use efficiency, shown in the left panel, revealing there has been an average 28% increase from the beginning to the end of the record. And interestingly, the area of strongest increase in their study occurred within the temperate forests of Central Europe, where summer soil moisture availability actually decreased over the last century. The right panel shows the historic water use efficiency values of an old stand of long-lived Fitzroya trees growing in southern Chile. The 32% increase observed here over the past century or so is equally striking. Now, if time would permit, I could show you numerous other examples of tree ring records depicting similar CO2-induced enhancements of water use efficiency from other locations across the globe. But alas, we must continue. The third expected benefit or biospheric impact of rising atmospheric CO2 is the amelioration of environmental stresses and resource limitations. Here, elevated CO2 has been shown to help plants better withstand and endure various environmental and resource limitations and stresses. One recent example in this regard comes from the study of Acif et al. Working under controlled environment conditions in Istanbul, Turkey, the group of researchers grew wheat seeds under either ambient or elevated CO2 and adequate or inadequate concentrations of zinc. Then, 41 days after sowing, half of the wheat plants were further subjected to moisture stress, where the soil moisture was gradually reduced to 25% of field capacity. And what were the individual and combined effects of these stresses? As shown in this graph, Grain yield, number of spikes per plant, and straw yield were all negatively impacted by moisture stress and low zinc conditions. However, elevated CO2 improved the value of these three parameters in every instance and was even able to totally ameliorate these two stresses, evidenced by a comparison of the growth values of plants from the elevated CO2, low zinc, and moisture stress chambers with those reported from the ambient CO2, adequate zinc, and well-watered chambers, which were not significantly different from one another. Another stress that is tempered by elevated CO2 is insect damage, noting that Australia has a highly diverse endemic insect fauna that feed on plant leaves and can cause considerable damage to the host plant via defoliation and dieback if outbreaks are severe enough. Gerlenda et al. Sought to quantify the population responses of three naturally occurring lerp-forming insect species in a eucalyptus forest under ambient and enriched levels of atmospheric CO2. In discussing their findings, the scientists report that elevated CO2 did not alter the outbreak potential or cause community compositional shifts, but it did reduce insect abundance by approximately 10 to 22%. In another paper, Mamdi and Nocter explored the potential impact of high CO2 on pathways involved in biotic stress resistance and related processes in plants to see if elevated CO2 could provide any relief to pathogen stress. In accomplishing their objective, they grew 2 ecotypes of thailcress, 2 bean varieties, and 1 variety of barley and another of wheat in a controlled environment chamber under 3 different CO2 concentrations for a period of 3 weeks, after which they infected them with either a pathogen that typically gains entry into the plant via stomata or a fungus that can enter by penetrating the cuticle. Results indicated that the growth of the plants in the CO2-enriched environment activated responses that are central to defense against pathogen attack. In particular, as shown in this figure, salicylic acid accumulation in plant leaves was increased by 16.2 and 13.8-fold in the 2 thailcress ecotypes, by 5.1 and 4.3-fold in the 2 bean varieties, and by 1.7 and 1.6-fold in the wheat and barley plants, respectively. Detailed analyses of the thailcress further revealed that elevated CO2 primed multiple defense pathways, leading to increased resistance from both bacterial and fungal stress. And that resistance is super good news. One final example of how elevated CO2 helps to alleviate plant environmental stresses and benefit the biosphere comes from the work of Brand et al. Specifically, they investigated the interactive effect of CO2, UVB radiation, and low temperature on root morphology and early seedling vigor of cotton cultivars. In describing their findings, Brand et al. Report that the vegetative growth of all cotton cultivars, including the root morphology traits, was negatively influenced by low temperature and increased UVB treatment. However, it was positively influenced by elevated CO2, which significantly increased the total biomass production of all cotton cultivars tested. Now, in this figure, we can see the positive impact of elevated CO2 on root growth, which stimulated longer, thicker, and highly branched roots, whereas the stress of low temperature and elevated UVB, either individually or in combination, suppressed most root traits. Well, in summing up this third major benefit of atmospheric CO2 enrichment, the amelioration of environmental stresses and resource limitations, atmospheric CO2 has not only been shown to help reduce the many and very detrimental effects presented in the aforementioned slides, but also the negative impacts of high soil salinity, high air temperature, low light intensity, low levels of soil fertility, oxidative stress, and macro and micronutrient excesses or deficiencies. What is more, the percentage growth enhancement produced by an increase in the air's CO2 content is often greater under these stressful and resource-limited conditions than it is when growing conditions are optimal. Well, altogether, the plant productivity gains that result from the aerial fertilization effect of the ongoing rise in atmospheric CO2, plus its transpiration-reducing effect that boosts plant water use efficiency, along with its stress-alleviating effect that lessens the negative growth impacts of resource limitations and environmental conditions, the world's vegetation possesses an ideal mix of abilities to reap tremendous benefit in the years and decades to come. And based on a multitude of real-world observations, that future is now, as evidence from all across the globe indicates that the terrestrial biosphere is already experiencing a great planetary greening, likely in large measure due to the approximate 40% increase in atmospheric CO2 since the beginning of the Industrial Revolution. Consider, for example, this figure, which shows that prior to around 1940, Earth's land surfaces were a net source of CO2 carbon to the atmosphere. From 1940 onward, however, the terrestrial biosphere has become, in the mean, an increasingly greater sink for CO2 carbon. This fact is further borne out in another study examining the sources and sinks of CO2, and which includes data for both the land and ocean. As seen here, the global carbon uptake has actually doubled over the past half-century, from 2.4 to 5.0 billion tons per year. Additional evidence of this great greening of the Earth is seen in satellite-derived data. Park et al., for example, recently determined that there has been a 21% increase in the gross primary productivity of the vegetation in the northern half of the northern hemisphere since 1982. Now, before I show you this next slide, which encompasses the entire globe, consider for a moment that since 1980, the Earth has weathered 3 of the warmest decades in the modern instrumental temperature record, as well as experienced a handful of persistent and intense El Niño events, has experienced large-scale deforestation, unprecedented forest fires, and episodes of persistent, widespread, and severe drought. At the same time, the air's CO2 content has increased by more than 16%, and the human population has grown by over 55%. So to the global warming alarmists, the Earth has been in the throes of a veritable climate Armageddon, if you will. So just how bad has the terrestrial biosphere suffered in response to these much-feared events? Well, to answer quite frankly, not at all. Increasing levels of atmospheric CO2 have actually helped to overpower these and other growth-inhibiting influences in all but a few locales. Such was the conclusion of Zhu et al., who analyzed long-term satellite-derived leaf area index records together with the output of 10 global ecosystem models over the period 1982 to 2009, and to document a persistent and widespread increase of the growing season integrated leaf area index, or greening, of the globe's vegetated area, evidenced by the green, blue, and violet shading in this figure. Further analyses revealed that CO2 fertilization effects explain 70% of the observed greening trend, followed by nitrogen deposition at 9%, climate change at 8%, and land cover change at 4%. Such satellite-derived evidences of a CO2-induced greening of the Earth should be welcome news to all, even to climate alarmists, especially when considering its impact on the global burden of atmospheric CO2. In this regard, Keenan et al. Note in a recent study that the CO2-induced greening observed in so many of Earth's terrestrial ecosystems likely offsets a large fraction of anthropogenic CO2 emissions, which phenomena should stunt the growth rate of atmospheric CO2 concentration. In a test of this hypothesis, the 7 authors used global carbon budget estimates, ground atmospheric and satellite observations, and multiple global vegetation models in an attempt to identify if there has been a recent pause in the growth rate of atmospheric CO2 and an associated decline in the fraction of anthropogenic emissions that remain in the atmosphere. As illustrated in this slide, they determined that despite a 4-fold increase in anthropogenic CO2 emissions since 1960, the airborne fraction of CO2 remaining in the atmosphere is no different today than it was nearly 60 years ago, which finding further confirms that thanks in large measure to the CO2 fertilization effect, the biosphere is effectively sequestering an increasingly greater amount of CO2 from the atmosphere each year, which phenomenon is acting as a negative feedback to slow and presently halt the annual growth rate of atmospheric CO2 to a value of around 2 parts per million per year. Such findings are truly staggering and suggest the nations need not fret over the ongoing increase in the atmosphere's CO2 concentration. for CO2 is truly the elixir of life for both plants themselves and indirectly all the planet's animal and human population as well. Shifting gears a bit, let me proceed with a brief discussion of some of the biospheric impacts of rising atmospheric CO2 that many are expecting will occur away from the terrestrial biosphere in the world's oceans. According to climate alarmist theory, as the air's CO2 content rises in response to ever-increasing anthropogenic CO2 emissions and as more and more carbon dioxide dissolves into the surface waters of the world's oceans, the pH of the planet's oceanic waters should be gradually decreasing. Based on this theory, it has been estimated that the globe's seawater has already declined by about 0.1 pH unit relative to what it was in pre-industrial times. And model calculations imply there could be an additional drop somewhere in the neighborhood of between 0.3 and 0.7 unit by the year 2300. A potential pH reduction of this magnitude is viewed by many as a cause for great concern, for it has been postulated to harm marine life not only by reducing the calcifying rates of marine organisms, but also by negatively impacting their rates of metabolism, growth, fertility, and survival. This ocean acidification hypothesis, as it has come to be known, has gained great momentum in recent years because it offers a second independent reason to regulate fossil fuel emissions, in addition to that provided by concerns over traditional global warming. For even if the models are proven to be wrong with respect to their predictions of atmospheric warming, extreme weather, glacial melt, sea level rise, or any other attendant catastrophe, those who seek to regulate and reduce CO2 emissions have this fallback position, claiming that no matter what happens to the climate, the nations of the earth must reduce their greenhouse gas emissions because of projected negative impacts on marine ecosystems via ocean acidification. Well, over time, the rhetoric of these acidification alarmists has swelled tremendously, giving rise to claims that, quote, by mid-century, if we continue emitting carbon dioxide the way we have been, entire vast areas of the Southern Ocean and the Arctic Ocean will be so corrosive that it will cause seashells to dissolve, and that we're really in the last decades of coral reefs on this planet for at least the next 1,000,000 years plus, unless we do something very soon to reduce CO2 emissions. Similar sentiments have been expressed by others who are concerned about the potential consequences of ocean acidification, with one alarmist scientist going so far as to claim that, quote, we know that coral reefs are particularly sensitive to ocean acidification. And the reason for that is that corals are unable to form their skeletons as quickly as they used to. And reefs are starting to crumble and disappear. We may lose those ecosystems within 20 to 30 years. We've got the last decade. Notice, and this was in 2009, I believe, that this was given. We have the last decade in which we can do something about this problem. But it is very, very clear that if we don't start to deal with it right now, with very, very stern cuts to emissions, we are going to condemn oceans to an extremely uncertain future. Well, the ocean chemistry aspect of this ocean acidification hypothesis is rather straightforward, but it is not as solid as model projections, alarmist scientists, politicians, or even famous movie stars make it out to be. For one thing, the work of a number of respected scientists suggests that the drop in oceanic pH will not be nearly as great as the IPCC and others predict. This figure shows much of the past and projected history of fossil fuel carbon utilization, together with historical and projected atmospheric CO2 concentrations out to the year 2500, as calculated by the well-respected NOAA scientist Peter Tans. As can be seen here, his analyses indicate that the air's CO2 concentration peaks well before 2100 at only 500 parts per million, as compared to the 800 parts per million value predicted in one of the IPCC's scenarios. When these emission estimates are transformed into reductions of oceanic pH, it can readily be seen that Tans's projection at 2100 is far below that predicted by the Intergovernmental Panel on Climate Change. Tans's analysis also projects a pH recovery to values near those today by the year 2300, suggesting that the ensuing atmospheric CO2 increase and associated oceanic pH decrease will not be anywhere near as serious as the acidification alarmists make it out to be. There are also many other important reasons for not jumping on the ocean acidification bandwagon, chief among which is the fact that, as with all phenomena involving living organisms, the introduction of life into the analysis greatly complicates things. For when a number of interrelated biological phenomena are considered, it becomes much more difficult, if not impossible, to draw such sweeping negative conclusions about the reaction of marine organisms to ocean acidification as climate alarmists often do. Quite to the contrary, when life is considered, ocean acidification is often found to be a non-problem or even a benefit. Earlier in my presentation, I alluded to the fact that not only do numerous studies show that elevated levels of atmospheric CO2 increase terrestrial plant photosynthesis, but they also enhance the productivity of aquatic ecosystems. In particular, the dissolution of CO2 into the surface waters of the world's oceans, that is, ocean acidification, or perhaps more appropriately named ocean carbonation, has benefited certain taxonomic groups, including nitrogen-fixing cyanobacteria, coccolithophores, and seagrasses. In a recently published paper on this latter category of marine species, Zimmerman et al. Set out to quantify the extent to which CO2 enrichment can improve the ability of eelgrass to tolerate stressful summer temperatures. Their reason for selecting eelgrass was due to the relatively large number of CO2 enrichment studies previously performed on this macroalgal species, plus the important role it plays in providing sediment stabilization and habitat for many ecologically and economically important invertebrates and fish. Their experiment was conducted at the Virginia Aquarium and Marine Science Center, where they pumped seawater from a nearby estuary into the series of outdoor aquaria containing eelgrass transplants. Now, the aquaria were maintained at 5 different pH values, all the way from 7.7 all the way down to 6.1 for a period of 18 months. Results of the study revealed that ocean carbonation increased eelgrass survival, shoot number, size, and growth. By the end of the experiment, eelgrass plants in the highest CO2 seawater treatment were some 3 times larger than the plants growing under ambient conditions, as visually documented in this accompanying figure. Elevated CO2 also stimulated leaf sugar concentration by 5-fold, of which accumulation the authors say it may be critical in regulating the flowering process in eelgrass, which rates under elevated CO2 were between 3 and 5 times higher than the 10% flowering rate typically observed under ambient conditions. Another major benefit of ocean carbonation is a surprising observation that elevated CO2 mitigated the impact of warm temperatures on eelgrass growth and survival. As described by Zimmerman et al., elevated CO2 prevented shoot losses during the warm summer when warm temperature exceeded the 25 degrees C threshold for thermal stress, and it eliminated the lethal effects of temperature. In light of these findings, Zimmerman et al. Concluded that it appears that ocean carbonation can serve as a quantitative antagonist to counter the negative impact of climate warming on eelgrass growth and survival, while adding that their findings reinforce the emerging paradigm that eelgrass may benefit significantly from a high CO2 world. Another recent study that provides optimism for the future of marine life comes from the work of Evanson and Edmonds. Publishing in the Journal of Experimental Biology, the pair of marine researchers hypothesized that coral reef colonies might be able to mediate or even reverse the negative effects of predicted ocean acidification on the rates of calcification. Specifically, it was their premise that coral colony density would alter the seawater flow regimes experienced by the colony, which would then modify the flux of metabolites between coral tissue and seawater, thereby altering the rates of important physiological functions such as calcification, photosynthesis, and respiration. As they explain, under future predictions of ocean acidification, some of the inhibitory consequences of low flow speeds for the metabolism of reef corals could be reversed, particularly for calcification, which outcome is hypothesized to occur because slow seawater flow results in a thickening of the diffusive boundary layer, which favors an increased pH in the seawater above the coral tissue as a result of CO2 uptake by photosynthesis, with the potentially important outcome of reducing the overall severity of calcification to ocean acidification. So consequently, the two scientists designed an experiment to determine if this mediation of ocean acidification is indeed possible. And to accomplish their objective, Evanson and Edmondson Edmonds measured the physiological performance of multiple coral colonies in a laboratory setting, where they were placed in different densities within a flume held at constant flow speed under ambient or reduced seawater pH. And results of their analysis are shown in this next slide. So as can be seen here, calcification in the light or daytime was negatively influenced by elevated CO2 in the low-density treatment, but enhanced in the high-density treatment. What is more is noted by Evanson and Edmonds. Despite mean calcification in the dark of densely aggregated corals declining by 45% at elevated CO2 compared with ambient, increased calcification in the light under the same PCO2 resulted in densely aggregated corals maintaining overall calcification rates that were comparable to those observed under ambient CO2. And as for the cause of this incredible feat, the scientists say that reduced flow speeds among colonies in the flume were the plausible mechanism, adding that reduced water flow and increased diffusive boundary layer thickness adjacent to the tissues of the densely aggregated colonies may have acted in concert with CO2 uptake through photosynthesis by endosymbiotic symbiodinium to elevate seawater pH in the diffusive boundary layer during the day. Now, such findings, in the words of Evanson and Edmonds, offer a compelling case for differential densities of branching coral colonies mediating the sensitivity of coral communities in at least some habitats. And they further report recent indications that neighboring organisms can create small-scale sites of refuge from the negative effects of ocean acidification. And of course, that's more good news for those concerned about the future health of these important ecosystems. Moving quickly from corals to fish, Dutil et al. Set out to conduct what they described as the most comprehensive study of its kind to date on the behavior of sea bass to future projections of ocean acidification. In doing so, they incubated fertilized European sea bass eggs in seawater of ambient and elevated CO2 and reared them in this environment up through the early juvenile stage. Then between days 59 to 68 of development, they conducted a series of analyses on the behavioral responses of these fish. As illuminated in this slide, the fish showed statistically similar movements, interactions with the environment, and interactions with each other, regardless of rearing or treatment condition. Such findings, in the words of the authors, indicate behavioral resilience to ocean acidification. And they add that for a schooling migratory fish like sea bass, our finding is good news, which suggests that we can be optimistic about their ability to cope with anthropogenic changes in the environment in the near future. Well, in addition to real-world observations characteristic of the preceding slides, there are other important phenomena that suggest the predicted decline in oceanic pH will have little to no lasting negative impacts on marine life. For starters, many experimental analyses are conducted at unrealistic future pH values that far exceed projections of their future decline, values that are likely never ever to occur in the real world. Many such experiments also suffer from a lack of appropriate acclimation period to the lowered seawater pH. In such instances, these organisms are subjected to what I call shock and awe placement in their new pH environment. Furthermore, I could probably count on my hand the number of ocean acidification experiments that actually allow for diurnal and longer temporal scale changes in pH, which changes can often exceed the laboratory-induced pH declines predicted to occur over the next century. Another problem that I only briefly highlighted in the previous slides is that most experimental analyses only assess an organism's response to ocean acidification in isolation, ignoring the important and sometimes critical interplay it experiences with other life forms within its little part of the world. Much research has shown that the responses of other entities and processes within a marine community have the potential to buffer the negative impacts of CO2-induced acidification on neighboring organisms. And as one example of this phenomenon, seagrass photosynthetic rates have been shown to increase by as much as 50% in response to increased levels of atmospheric CO2, which increase may deplete the community CO2 pool, thereby maintaining an elevated pH that may protect associated calcifying organisms from the impacts of broader ocean acidification. Another reason to be skeptical of the ocean acidification hypothesis rests in the fact that the models upon which the hypothesis is based are focused on changes in bulk water chemistry that do not represent conditions actually experienced by marine organisms, which are separated from the bulk water of the ocean by a diffusive boundary layer. This is important because photosynthetic activities such as that of the zooxanthellae that are hosted by corals depletes CO2 and raises pH, so that the pH that is actually experienced by organisms on the inside of the diffusive boundary layer can greatly differ from that of the bulk water. Now, beyond these considerations, it is important to note that essentially all forms of marine life have the inherent genetic capacity to adapt and evolve. Most ocean acidification experiments to date have been conducted over the short-term time period of days to weeks, and many are conducted over periods of only a few hours, all of which times are much too short to allow organisms the necessary time to adapt or evolve in order to successfully cope with the new environmental conditions. Yet the few studies that have explored this aspect of the debate confirm that transgenerational plasticity, adaptation, and even evolution can and do take place, and on very short timescales, thus allowing marine organisms to not only withstand and cope with the declining oceanic pH, but to benefit and take advantage of it. And finally, there is the issue of publication bias, where journals are more apt to publish papers if there is a negative finding in their study. After all, who cares to read about a non-finding in a non-problematic issue? Well, in winding my presentation down today, being in the presence of so many doctors and physicians, there's one final topic that I'd like to briefly discuss: the impact of CO2-induced global warming on human mortality. This topic has long been an alarmist concern, where it has been postulated that rising global temperatures will lead to an increase in the number of deaths at the hot end of the temperature spectrum due to an elevation in the frequency and intensity of heat waves. However, others have charged that rising temperatures will also reduce the number of deaths at the cold end of the temperature spectrum in consequence of fewer and less severe cold spells, resulting in possibly no net change or even fewer total temperature-related deaths in the future. Now, the prevailing viewpoint to date is the latter, that is, that global warming will be net beneficial to human mortality by reducing the total number of lives lost to temperature-related events. Now, the latest work adding to this ever-growing body of evidence comes from Zhao et al. As their contribution to the subject, they examined the association between daily mean ambient temperature and emergency department visits, which we will use here as an analog of mortality, in 12 geographically dispersed Chinese cities. Statistical analyses were performed to examine each city's relationship between daily mean temperature and emergency department visits, the results of which were then pooled to yield regional and then national findings. As represented by the pooled national data shown in this figure, the results indicate that the relative risk of emergency department visits increases as temperatures become both warm and cold. However, the risk is far more severe with cold temperatures. Additionally, Zhao et al. Determined that the effects of cold spells on emergency department visits were much more persistent, lasting a full 30 days compared to the more acute but short-lived effects of warm spells that lasted a mere 3 days. Other important findings in the study included the observation that the temperature percentile associated with the least amount of emergency department visits was 64. At 14 percentage points higher than 50, this fact suggests that the population is much more adapted to warmer temperatures than cold. Additionally, it was determined that the temperature effect on emergency department visits varied by latitude. The effect of extreme cold was higher in the southern cities and declined northward, whereas the effect of extreme heat was higher in the northern cities and then declined southward, which findings suggest a form of regional adaptation to temperature. Furthermore, by stratifying their analyses by gender and age, the 13 researchers report that temperature emergency department visit relationship was unaffected by gender, but was attenuated with increasing age. Children ages 0 to 14 were considered to be the age group most vulnerable to cold spells and heat waves over the period of study, whereas the elderly aged 65 or older were the least vulnerable. Now, in considering these several findings, plus those reported in numerous other studies of the subject, it is clear that the impact of cold weather on human health is much more severe and longer lasting than that caused by heat waves. The truth be told, humanity has much more to gain in terms of physical health from rising as opposed to falling temperatures. Well, I think that my time is about up, and we've only scratched the surface on our exploration of the many benefits or biospheric impacts of rising atmospheric CO2. Nevertheless, it is my hope that it is as clear to you as it is to me, based on numerous real-world observations and laboratory experiments, that recent theoretical claims of impending biospheric havoc due to increases in atmospheric CO2 concentrations have little, if any, basis in empirical reality. In fact, the model-based contentions are often outright refuted by demonstrable facts, as highlighted in my presentation and documented in depth in the many research papers reviewed on our CO2 Science website. For far too long now, such facts have been downplayed or ignored by the media, activists, scientists, non-governmental organizations, and by elected and appointed government officials who have besmirched and defamed the many virtues of this important trace gas. Atmospheric CO2 is not a pollutant. It is the elixir of life. Thank you.
We have a little bit of time for questions. If you have a question, please come to the mic.
Craig, I've noticed I'm a mechanic, okay? I work on vehicles, ran a garage for 30 plus years. And a lot of the trade science that's used in the trade magazines that I read and follow, they seem to, we need this kind of information out there because in a practical consideration, in real world repair, they consider that CO2 is a poison, that it is a impending disaster. You hear that all the time. And yet when you go and talk to people like myself out in the field, you find that we have to dealing with the practical realities is considerably different, as you have shown, than dealing with what they think is going on. And yet they are the ones with the megaphones. And they're the ones with the deep pockets, as it were. And they're out here looting everybody else in order to promote a lie, basically. So thank you for doing such, I knew your dad, I saw one of his experiments 20 years ago. And we need to take that material and put it in a practical application every day. And I try to do that every day where I work. I work for a construction company now. And we run into that all the time. And it's amazing what can happen when you can put people in possession of facts that really do work every day, not just the ones who talk about doing work.
Yeah.
But thank you.
Thank you very much. Appreciate that. And I think it's true. We do face a tremendous battle. There's a lot of money and forces marshaled against the truth about CO2. But it's interesting to me, too, though, that everywhere I go and I speak to people, especially like I'll go to a conference like this and talk to the person who's driving me to the airport or to and from the airport. You know, the general person, the lay person out there generally understands that CO2 is good. At least the ones that are above age 20 or 30 because they were taught back in 5th grade that CO2 was plant food. So most people do understand it despite all that enormous amount of effort and money that's going against us, but still very uphill battle.
Thank you. I'm Dr. George Isayu, past president of the Catholic Medical Association. Thank you very much for your research. As you and then Dr. Moon have shown before, most of the changes in climate are due to natural phenomenon, and it would be inconceivable that, when God created the earth and it survived so many different changes over millions of years, that there would not be built-in compensatory mechanisms that would compensate for whatever changes occurred, and so forth. But I'd just like to mention a separate topic, because we're so worried about CO2 as being pollution. Well, when you have, I don't know if you're familiar with research, I'm not prepared to quote it at the moment, but there's a PhD, Dr. Le Chevalier, who studied, legitimate research about what goes into the water and the water supply and the decrease in fish populations. He was able to show that the tremendous amount of steroids, of estrogenic type steroids, which mainly come from birth control pills, are not filtered out by the various sewage projects and are excreted into the water and have been responsible for a decrease in reproduction of fish species in the oceans, which are, of course, always blamed on overfishing and so forth. So just wanted to add that in as a phenomenon of true pollution, and that is considered a sacred cow. Nobody looks at that as a possible problem.
Yeah, thank you. Yeah, great comment. Same thing in this field. You know, I read you those quotes from the two ocean acidification alarmists, and that's how it happens in this line of work. Unfortunately, you'll have someone come out with some crazy statement and claim, you know, blaming CO2 for it, you know, ultimately. And then it takes a good 3 or 4 or 5 years for the true scientists that are down in the trenches that we talked about to actually do the research and determine whether or not that statement was true. Meanwhile, you know, it's too late by the time it gets published 5 years later. You know, it's crazy how it goes. Please.
Hi, I'm Kathleen Peterson, and I very much enjoyed your lecture. It was one of the most synoptic lectures that I've heard.
Thank you.
I was curator of cultures at the University of California for many years and raised a lot of algae and other organisms. And I just wanted you to know that the way that we put it at that time is that CO2 and that goes with it is the basis of life on Earth and evolution. And I want to thank you for one of the most brilliant lectures that I've heard, pulling it all together. Thank you.
I appreciate that comment. Thank you very much. Please.
I just want to make sure I understand. When you refer to acidification, is that a reduction in alkalinity?
Yes.
Okay.
Yeah, exactly right. So the average pH of the ocean is around 8.1, so it's alkaline. And so the declining pH is referred to ocean acidification. It's splitting hairs with a hatchet. If you notice, I also mentioned ocean carbonation, you know, as a kind of a play on the words. Instead of acidification, carbonation is a better word, a way to describe it.
It's how they wrote the language, right?
That's true. A lot of it's in the language.
You have to insist on certain accurate wording.
Yeah, yeah.
Win back the argument just to make sure people are clear on that.
Howard.
Craig, just to add to some of the stuff that you have said, if we add CO2 to water, we get carbonic acid, and that is acidification. What happens if a plant removes CO2 from the water? Isn't that called photosynthesis? Doesn't that increase the pH?
I guess. All right, thank you very much. Appreciate it.